The day Maren Doyle buried her husband, 3 men from town offered to buy the marshland before she'd even left the cemetery. She said no to all 3. They smiled the way men smile when they think a woman doesn't understand what she's turning down. Maren understood perfectly. She just didn't care about their math. The land had come to her through her father, who'd gotten it from his uncle, who'd cleared the first acre of it by hand sometime in the 1880s. Nobody in Harwick County had ever wanted it. 42 acres of low floodplain at the southern edge of the Callaway Basin, cattails, standing water 8 months out of 12, mosquitoes thick enough to darken the air at dusk. The deed had passed down the family line, less like an inheritance and more like a debt nobody could figure out how to refuse. When Maren's father died 2 years before Owen did, people assumed she'd finally sell it then, get something for it before the county condemned it for drainage. Instead, she'd driven out there alone on a Tuesday morning, walked the perimeter in rubber boots, and come home with mud to her knees and a set of notes she'd written in the margins of an old survey map. Owen had looked at those notes and known better than to ask. Now Owen was gone, heart sudden, 51 years old, and the marsh was hers alone, and the 3 men from the cemetery were not the last people who would tell her what she ought to do with it. She was 31. She had a daughter named Ivy who was 7, a pickup truck with a cracked manifold, and $1,100 in a checking account that the funeral had gotten closer to $500. She had the house in town, which had a mortgage. She had the marsh, which had none. What she did not have was a plan that made sense to anyone but herself. The town of Harwick sat on a ridge above the basin, the kind of small agricultural town that had been the same size for 40 years in either direction and expected to stay that way. Feed stores, a hardware with a rotating inventory that hadn't fully rotated since 1994, 2 diners, a gas station, a volunteer fire department, and a social architecture so settled and familiar that a stranger could walk in and within 20 minutes understand exactly who deferred to whom and why. Maren had grown up here. She understood the architecture. What she hadn't understood until Owen died was how much of her standing in it had been borrowed from him. Owen Doyle had been liked, genuinely, unreservedly liked, easy to talk to, fair in his dealings, the kind of man who remembered what you'd told him 6 months ago and asked about it. When Maren stood next to him at the hardware counter or the 4th of July potluck, she was Maren Doyle, Owen's wife, and that was a comfortable place to stand. Alone, she was something different, not unwelcome, just unclassified. And then she started spending her weekends at the marsh. The first person to say something about it directly was Herschel Beaumont, who ran the feed store and had opinions about everything in Harwick County. He caught her loading sacks of seed into the truck, a particular mix she'd had to order special, not anything he carried, and asked what she thought she was doing with bottomland that couldn't grow a crop if you prayed over it. She told him she was going to grow a crop. He laughed, not unkindly, which almost made it worse. Maren, he said, the way people say a name when they mean be reasonable, that ground holds water 6 inches down. You can't farm wet. Some things grow wet, she said. He shook his head the way men do when they've decided the conversation is over. She loaded the last sack herself and drove south. By spring, other people were saying other things. She heard them the way you hear weather coming, not because anyone said it to her face, but because Harwick was small enough that sound traveled. At the diner, at the school pickup line, at the counter of the hardware where she went in alone now to buy pipe fittings and drainage tile. She heard her father's name used as a cautionary example. She heard the word stubborn, used the way people use it when they mean something less polite. She heard someone ask, not quietly enough, what that Doyle woman thought she was doing out there, and whether someone ought to check if she was all right. She was all right. She was building something. What she was building had started with those notes in the margins of the survey map, which had started with a conversation with her father's uncle, Abe, who had died when she was 14, but who she still thought about with a specific and useful clarity. Abe had spent 40 years on that marsh and had understood things about it that no county assessor had ever bothered to measure. He knew where the water came from, not just rainfall, but the slow lateral seep from the ridge above, where the limestone shelf tilted down and released groundwater into the basin at a rate that was steady and predictable and independent of drought. He knew which edges of the property drained fast and which held. He knew that the low places, the ones everyone else saw as waste, were the most reliably wet ground in the whole county. meaning they were the most reliably productive, if you understood what productive could mean in wet ground. Maren had listened to all of this at 14 with half her attention, the way teenagers absorb things they don't know, yet they'll need. But the other half had stayed, and when she was 22 and taking an agriculture extension course in Millhaven, one lecture on wetland cultivation had unlocked everything Abe had told her into sudden coherent sense. She'd sat in that classroom and thought, he knew. He figured all of that out by looking. Now she was doing the same thing, looking, measuring, testing. She'd put in drainage channels along the high edges to control where water moved. She'd amended the soil in the raised sections with material she hauled in herself, load by load, mixing by hand. She'd planted things that other people didn't plant in this part of the state, watercress in the channels, cranberries in the low bogs she'd shaped and lined, specialty greens in the raised beds where the drainage let her control the moisture to the inch. She'd ordered 3 books from a university agricultural library through interlibrary loan and read them twice. It was slow. It was physical in a way that left her hands rough and her back sore by Sunday evening. Ivy came with her sometimes on weekends, and Maren would explain what she was doing in plain language, while Ivy mostly looked for frogs. On the drive home, Ivy would ask questions that were sometimes the exact questions Maren was asking herself, which was either comforting or unsettling depending on the day. Why does the water go that way and not the other way? Because I think the ground sloped there. So the water follows. What happens if it rains a lot? The channels take it out before it floods the beds. What if it doesn't rain? Maren had been quiet for a moment. That's the part I'm still working on. The second summer was the summer people stopped just talking and started saying things directly. A woman named Patricia Weld, whose husband farmed corn on the flat ground north of town, good ground, county road frontage, the kind of farm that made sense to everybody, stopped Maren at the school pickup line in June and asked with genuine-sounding concern whether Maren had thought about what she was going to do if this didn't work out. Maren asked what she meant. I just mean, Patricia said, you've put a lot into that property. And with the mortgage on the house and Ivy to think about, it might be better to cut your losses before it gets harder. Maren looked at her for a moment. Who did you hear that from? I'm just saying what people are thinking. I know, Maren said. That's my question. She didn't say it with heat. She said it the way she said most things, which was flatly and directly, with the specific expressionlessness that people sometimes mistook for coldness and was actually just the face she made when she was paying close attention. Patricia looked briefly uncomfortable, and then her son appeared and the conversation ended. But Maren drove home with the familiar low hum of something she'd learned not to call anger, because calling it anger gave it more weight than it needed. It was more like information. People thought she was going to fail. That was information. She could use it, or she could let it go. She let it go, mostly. She went back to the marsh. The 3rd year was when she found the spring. She'd known there was water moving through the eastern edge of the property. Abe had mentioned it, and the survey notes hinted at it, and the ground there was wet in a way that wasn't fully explained by rainfall patterns. But she hadn't located the source until she spent a full October weekend walking the edge of the ridge with a probe rod, testing depth and flow, the way Abe had described doing it when he was young. It was her daughter who found it, technically. Ivy was 11 by then, more interested in helping than she'd been at 7, and she was ahead of Maren along the ridge when she called back that the ground felt different here, softer, almost like it was breathing. Maren came and probed and found it 2 feet down, a consistent upwelling, cold, coming from the limestone shelf, above at a rate she estimated by the end of the weekend at something between 15 and 20 gallons per minute. Steady, gravity-fed, not dependent on surface rainfall. She sat on the ridge in the late afternoon and looked out over the marsh and thought about what her father's uncle had known, and she had half known and had now confirmed with her own hands. And she felt something she didn't have an exact word for. It was more like recognition, like finding out that something you'd suspected for a long time was actually true. She began designing the collection system the following week. The drought came the summer Ivy turned 12. It didn't come all at once. Droughts rarely do. It came the way bad things often come to agricultural places, as a slow subtraction, a series of months that were each a little drier than expected, adding up over time to something that couldn't be explained away. The previous autumn had been dry. The winter had been dry. Spring brought half the rainfall the basin usually expected, and by June the corn north of town was showing stress, and by July the wells on 3 farms were drawing low, and by August the county extension office was holding meetings that people attended with the kind of quiet faces that mean the situation is serious and they already know it. The Callaway Basin had seen drought before. The old-timers knew what it looked like and what it did to the farms along the ridge, and how long recovery took afterward. It was not a catastrophe, not yet, but it had the feel of something that was going to get worse before it got better. Maren's marsh did not dry up. The spring on the eastern edge ran the same in August as it had in March. The channels she'd built moved that water through the system the way she'd designed them to, and the beds that needed moisture had it, and the beds that needed drainage had that too. The watercress in the channels was green, while the ditches along the county road had gone to cracked mud. The cranberry bogs held their level. The specialty greens she'd been selling to a restaurant supplier in Millhaven continued to come in on schedule, the only consistent produce supply the supplier had left in the county by the end of July. She noticed people driving slowly past the property on the county road. She didn't think much of it. People had been looking at the marsh for 3 years, first with skepticism, and then with something closer to puzzlement, and now she was beginning to understand, with something else entirely. The first person who came down the drive was a farmer named Curtis Webb, who ran a vegetable operation 2 miles north, and whose irrigation pond had gone to less than a foot of standing water. He drove in one morning in late July without calling ahead, which was the way people in Harwick handled uncomfortable requests. Show up in person so it's harder to refuse. Maren was in the beds when he came. She straightened up and waited. Curtis was a straightforward man, not given to preamble. He said he'd heard she had water. He said his pond was going dry, and his drip lines were pulling air, and he had 12 acres of tomatoes that were going to be finished by the end of the week if he didn't find a source. He said he knew and he hadn't had much occasion to speak, and he said he knew he wasn't the first person in Harwick who'd had doubts about what she was doing out here, and he'd like to set that aside if she was willing. He stopped talking and looked at her. "What are you asking for exactly?" Maren said. "Water rights. Temporary. I'd pay for it." She thought about it for a long moment. Not the decision. She'd made that before he finished speaking. She was thinking about how to structure it. "I'm not going to sell rights," she said. "I'll share access. You bring your own pump and line. You pull from the channel at the east edge, and you don't disturb my drainage system. And when this is over, you help me put in a second collection cistern on the upper ridge." Curtis looked at her. "That's not money." "No," she said. "It's better." He thought about it for less than a minute. He held out his hand and she shook it. Curtis Webb was not the last person who came down that drive. By the middle of August, she had 3 informal agreements in place. Curtis for the tomatoes, a woman named Leona Fitch, who ran a market garden and couldn't afford to lose her fall planting, and an older man named Raymond Buell, who needed water for his cattle and had the equipment and the labor to help her extend the spring collection system further along the ridge. Each agreement was different because each situation was different. None of them were written down. In Harwick, there were still dealings that ran on handshake, and she preferred those because they required both parties to behave like people. Patricia Weld came in the 3rd week of August. Maren had wondered if she would. She had half expected her not to, pride being what it is, and the things Patricia had said at the school pickup line being what they were. But Patricia came, and she came alone, without her husband, which Maren understood to mean something. She stood at the edge of the drive and looked out at the marsh, the green channels, the beds, the cistern on the ridge, the irrigation line that ran to Curtis's field visible in the distance, and then she looked at Maren. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You were saying what you thought," Maren said. "That's not nothing. I was wrong. Yes." A pause. Not uncomfortable. "Gerald's corn is finished," Patricia said. Gerald was her husband. "The early stuff. He might save the late planting if he gets water in the next week." Maren told her what she'd told the others. Bring your own equipment, follow the protocols, contribute labor for the ridge extension when the time came. Patricia nodded at each condition. She didn't try to negotiate, which Maren respected. Before she left, Patricia said, "How did you know the spring was there?" Maren thought about Abe, about the survey map and the margins notes and the library books and the October weekend with the probe rod. About Ivy standing on the ridge saying the ground felt like it was breathing. "My father's uncle," she said. "He farmed this ground for 40 years and paid attention." Patricia nodded slowly. "We should have paid more attention to what you were doing out here." "Yes," Maren said again. Then, "But you're paying attention now. That's not nothing either." The ridge extension took most of September, with 6 people working it in sections on the weekends. By the time the first rains came in October, still light, still less than normal, but enough to signal that the worst of the drought had passed. The collection system ran the full length of the eastern ridge, feeding 3 cisterns that together held enough water to carry the marsh operations through another dry summer without drawing down the spring. The restaurant supplier in Millhaven called her in November to say he wanted to double his order for the following year. He'd had 3 other suppliers fail him during the drought. She was the only one who hadn't. She told him she'd think about it because she wanted to be sure about capacity before she committed. She did not say yes immediately even to good things, which was a habit she'd developed from watching what happened to people who did. Ivy asked her at dinner that week whether they were going to be okay now. Maren looked at her daughter, 12 years old, red-cheeked from helping in the beds after school, tracking mud on the kitchen floor the same way she'd been tracking mud on the kitchen floor since she was old enough to walk. "We've been okay," Maren said. "I know," Ivy said, "but like, more okay." Maren thought about that for a moment. The mortgage was the same. The truck manifold was still cracked. The money was better, but not easy. The marsh still needed 2 more years of investment before it would run the way she'd designed it to run in her head. "Getting there," she said. Ivy accepted this in the way she accepted most things, which was with a nod that meant she'd file it away and come back to it when she had more questions. She was like Owen in that. She thought about things at her own pace, and then arrived at conclusions that were usually better than the ones other people had arrived at faster. Maren missed Owen. She missed him in the particular way you miss someone who would have understood what you were doing without needing it explained, who would have looked at the spring on the ridge and the channels and the green beds in August when everything else in the county was brown and dry, and simply said, "Yes, I see it." She thought about him often at the marsh. Not in a sad way, mostly. In the way you think about people who shaped how you see things, which is a form of gratitude that doesn't require them to be present. The following spring, Herschel Beaumont stopped her in the feed store parking lot. She was loading a different mix than the first one she'd ordered from him. She'd changed the formula twice in 3 years, as she understood the soil better. And he stood by the tailgate and watched her for a moment. "How's the property doing?" he said. "Good," she said. "Better than last year. I heard you pulled Curtis Webb's tomatoes through. And Leona, Fitch. They pulled their own tomatoes through," Maren said. "They did the work." Herschel was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had been wrong about things before and knew how to be uncomfortable with it. "I remember when your father's uncle used to talk about that ground," he said finally. "Abe. He'd come in here and say there was good water moving under that eastern ridge, and nobody believed him either." Maren set the last bag in the truck. "Did you tell him that? That you didn't believe him?" Herschel had the grace to look down. "Probably. He would have kept going anyway," Maren said. "He always did." She didn't say it with sharpness. She said it the way she said most things. Flat, direct, as simple as she could make it. Then she got in the truck and drove south toward the marsh, where there was work left to do before the light went. The property looked different now than it had the morning after Owen's funeral when she'd first walked it alone in rubber boots. The drainage channels were defined and clear. The beds were laid out in a logic that made sense if you understood the water's behavior, and a few people in Harwick were beginning to understand it. The spring on the eastern ridge ran cold and steady out of the limestone above, the same as it always had, the same as it had when Abe was alive, and walking that ground and paying attention to what the land was actually trying to tell him. Maren pulled on her boots and went to work. The ground held water where she needed it to hold, and drained where she needed it to drain, and the spring did not care about drought or opinion or the things people said in parking lots. It ran because of geology, because of the angle of the limestone shelf, because of forces that had been working for 10,000 years before anyone had drawn a property line across them. She had not created any of that. She had only found it, and believed it, and built around it, until other people could see what she had always seen, that, in the end, was the whole of it.